Hi everyone. This week our studies will focus on the culture of the Rabbinic Beit Midrash, and this presentation is specifically on the meaning of oral Torah. We have two terms here, Torah shebichtav, written Torah, and Torah sheba'al peh, oral Torah. What is oral Torah? Well, the term is used in three distinct ways. The first meaning is the most straightforward. Sometimes when people use the term oral Torah or Torah Shebaal Peh, they're simply using a synonym for what we would call the rabbinic library, any work that's attributed to the rabbis, including the Mishnah, the Tosefta, any work of Midrash, and the two Talmuds. That's pretty straightforward. It's the other two meanings that we're going to spend most of our time today trying to develop and disentangle. Because one sense of oral Torah relates to the way that oral Torah is revealed and transmitted. But in another sense, oral Torah speaks to a phenomenon of ongoing discovery, interpretation, and expansion. So, what is oral about the oral Torah? This has been a topic of lots of interesting scholarship in recent years. And according to Professor Elizabeth Shanks Alexander, this is in one of the articles that was assigned for today, rabbinic sources actually convey two distinct views of what is oral about the oral Torah. So, this is what she calls view number one. According to this view, what's distinctive about oral Torah is that it is a reliable form of transmission. According to this view, oral transmission is what creates an unbroken chain of tradition that goes back to Mount Sinai. In this conception of oral Torah, it's different than how we usually think about oral culture, because we usually think about oral culture as a culture that admits and maybe even celebrates change. If you think about a game of telephone, where one person whispers a message to another, and that person to another, and that person to another, and another, that's a model for how we generally think about oral cultures. And the fun of that game is the surprise of seeing how the message changes bit by bit at every stage of transmission. So what's important to remember is that in rabbinic tradition, in this first notion of what oral Torah is all about, there's a very, very different idea about oral transmission. Oral transmission is not a game of telephone, but this orality, this tradition, person to person, generation to generation, is what makes the tradition reliable, so that it is unchanging, so that it is solid. In this conception of oral Torah, the orality of oral Torah makes it even more reliable than things that are written down. Once things are written down, according to this view, they don't live anymore in the mind or the memory, and they can be lost, they can be forgotten, they can be erased. But oral Torah is solid, is reliable, because it lives in the minds of students from generation to generation. This is one view of what oral Torah means, according to Shanks Alexander. But alongside this idea of oral Torah that we find in the sources of oral Torah themselves is a very, very different view on what oral Torah means. And in this second way of understanding oral Torah, according to Shanks Alexander, has more to do with the dynamic encounter among sacred text, teacher, and student than with the stability of tradition enabled by technologies of memory. In other words, in this second view, oral Torah is oral because in the transmission from teacher to student, there is dynamism, there is change, there is interpretation, there is an expansion. This is a very different view of oral Torah, and these two meanings of oral Torah live side by side in the sources, as we will now see. So the notion of oral Torah as transmission is perhaps most famously expressed in the very opening lines of Pirkei Avot that we studied together at the beginning of the term. Moses received Torah from Sinai and transmitted it to Joshua, and Joshua to the elders, and the elders to the prophets, and the prophets transmitted it to the men of the great assembly. A package passed on from person to person, from generation to generation, stable, reliable, unchanging. That's the first view. But here's the second view, also present in our sources, and this is a tradition that I distributed to you also on the first day. The famous story of when Moses ascended on high and found the Holy One engaged in attaching crownlets to letters. Moses said to God, "Lord of the universe, why should you bother with this?" And God answered, "There is a man who is destined to arise at the end of many generations, named Akiva ben Yosef, who will expound upon each crownlet heaps and heaps of law." So in this Talmudic tradition, we have a real celebration of expounding, of interpreting, of expanding Torah. And oral Torah is the interpretation of the written Torah. So in a lot of rabbinic sources, we see these two different notions of oral Torah side by side, and really they express two distinct rabbinic values. They come up, for example, in this tradition, also from Pirkei Avot, where we read that Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples: Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, Rabbi Yossi the priest, Rabbi Shimon ben Netaniel, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach. And he used to list the outstanding virtues of each student. He called Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus a plastered cistern that loses not a drop. Rabbi Joshua ben Hananiah, happy is the woman who gave birth to him. Rabbi Yossi the priest, a pious man. Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, one who fears sin. And Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, an overflowing spring. Now what I really want to call your attention to are these two powerful images that both engage water. Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus is compared to a plastered cistern that loses not a drop. And in this image, we find the rabbinic value of memory as being that which sustains tradition, stable and unchanging, losing nothing, adding nothing, changing nothing. A plastered cistern receives and holds that which it receives. On the other hand, Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai is also able to recognize the unique talents and gifts of Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, who he compares to an overflowing spring. The opposite of a plastered cistern, a spring, is changing, dynamic all of the time. It's more Torah, more growth, more change. And in some traditions, we see a tension between these two rabbinic values. So Rabban Yochanan used to boast about one of his students who he compared to the plastered cistern. He said, if all the sages of Israel were on one scale of the balance and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus on the other scale, he would outweigh them all. That is, the one who has these wonderful powers of memory to hold on to that which he received, to not change it. That's who Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai wants to celebrate. But there's another tradition. Abba Shaul said in his name, if all the sages of Israel were on one scale of the balance and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus was also with them, and Rabbi Elazar ben Arach was on the other side, he would outweigh them all. In other words, according to this tradition, it's that dynamic, ever-changing, ever-flowing spring, that oral Torah is expansive, that is celebrated above all else. Another image in which we see these two values. Rabbi Yochanan said, there is a dispute between Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel and the rabbis. One says a Sinai is better, the other says an uprooter of mountains is better. So here we've moved from water imagery to mountain imagery. And the Sinai is an image that imagines the rabbi, like that spring, as someone who receives and holds, who doesn't lose, who doesn't change. But on the other side, there is a celebration of another kind of rabbi, opposite to the Sinai, an uprooter of mountains, a revolutionary thinker, a transformative interpreter. In general, this celebration for an expansive, dynamic, changing tradition, this notion, the second notion of the orality of oral Torah, is strongly associated with the Bavli. And the later sources of the Bavli, of the Babylonian Talmud, are a lot more explicit about which side they fall on, about which rabbinic value they value more. So here's a tradition that will be familiar to you about that special relationship between Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish died, and you'll remember that Rabbi Yochanan is brokenhearted. This is not Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who we met in Pirkei Avot. This is the Palestinian Amora, Rabbi Yochanan, an early Amora, but you'll remember that oftentimes, like in this tradition, we have much later rabbis in Babylonia from the time of the editing of the Babylonian Talmud, talking about earlier generations of rabbis. And as they talk about these earlier generations, they project back on the earlier generations their own ethos, their own values, their own culture. So this is an example of the editors of the Babylonian Talmud telling a story about rabbis they respect from the past and using those figures from the past to express their own values, their own culture. And their own culture is one that celebrates dynamism, interpretation, and change with regard to the oral tradition. The rabbi said, "Who shall we send to ease the mind of the broken-hearted Rabbi Yochanan? Let us send Rabbi Elazar ben Padat, whose teachings are sharp." Rabbi Elazar ben Padat went and sat before Rabbi Yochanan. Anything that Rabbi Yochanan said, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat would say to him, "There is a rabbinic tradition that supports you." Rabbi Yochanan said, "Are you like Reish Lakish? The son of Lakish, when I would say something, he would raise 24 difficulties and I would resolve them in 24 ways, and from this, the tradition would expand." Here we have an expression of the Babylonian Talmud's editors' celebration of an expansive oral Torah that's always changing, that's always growing. Muli Vidas is a contemporary scholar based at Princeton who studies the continuities between the values and the culture of the rabbinic study house in Babylonia and the religious and scholastic cultures of the Jews' neighbors, both Zoroastrians and Christians living in that setting. And he distinguishes between two modes of mastery that the rabbis are aware of, and this is a distinction that he claims that they share with other scholarly cultures in the Zoroastrian milieu. He writes, "This dichotomy between the transmission of text on the one hand and the creation of new knowledge on the other was central to the way the creators of the Talmud understood themselves, to the way they wanted to be perceived, and to the way they distinguished themselves from others." According to Vidas, the Zoroastrians also had two kinds of religious expertise. On the one hand, they had people who were charged with memorizing sacred texts, and they were repeaters or reciters. And on the other hand, they had scholars who were even more esteemed and respected because they were empowered to interpret the text and create new knowledge. According to Vidas, the creators of the Talmud disparaged the rote learning in their own milieu of those that they called the Ba'alei Mishnah, the Tanaim, the repeaters or reciters, and instead celebrated the creativity and virtuosity of sages who could analyze and innovate and not merely transmit. And so we are left with this dual heritage when it comes to oral Torah, a value of transmitting an unchanging tradition on the one hand, but on the other hand, the later rabbis celebrate change, expansion, and interpretation as the quintessential features of the oral Torah.